Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. Over the years of World of Warcraft, Blizzard has crafted some of the strongest abilities in the game. What makes them strong doesn't always have to be damage, but rather the usefulness, the uniqueness, and the utility. And it would be impossible to imagine some of these abilities returning in Shadowlands because they would simply make our classes absolutely broken. In today's video, I wanted to highlight the abilities that will be the most over the top for the current Shadowlands PvE content. That means mostly dungeons as well as raiding. There's quite a lot of abilities and some of them would absolutely be incredible for classes in terms of all kinds of content like world content, and there's others that would be simply game breaking if they were to be added for PvP. So maybe in future videos we'll end up covering some of those abilities. As per usual, most of you guys watching these videos are not subscribed, so if you want to see more content like this or 9.1 in future Shadowlands updates, subscribe to the channel and let's get into the video. Starting off with the Death Knights, they were very well known as a really broken class back during the days of Wrath of Lich King. They were the only class at the time that could tank and DPS as all three of their specs, and came with a variety of unique abilities for the time that allowed them to kind of be stronger than the other classes. They definitely had some of the coolest unique abilities as well as very cool lore behind them, which made them super appealing for many players to pick up. Death Knights had, as Unholy, a ability where you could actually resurrect yourself, come back as a ghoul, and actually deal quite a bit of damage with Shadow of Death. In Shadowlands, we have certain abilities from the Covenants that do allow a cheat death mechanic. But imagine being Unholy Death Knight with Shadow of Death right now. I imagine there are a few mechanics that would simply be broken if a Death Knight could, let's say, play Necrolord with Earmere Soulbind, fall in battle and become armor, where they can continue fighting for a little bit longer for 10 seconds, immune to damage but not really doing that much themselves, and then the armor falls and they rise back up as a ghoul so they can fight some more, and right as they're about to die they could use the ghoul explosion in order to do one final burst of damage before finally killing over. Death Knights would end up being some of the strongest tanks in the game that live forever, and even as a DPS, they might be able to find ways to cheese certain boss mechanics if they had multiple cheat deaths. For druids, it's a low-hanging fruit, but I would imagine that Symbiosis would be amazing no matter the expansion we discuss. Symbiosis was an ability given to them during Mists of Pandaria for a time, and I'm so glad I played back in MoP, and I'm glad that I played Druid back then. It was one of the most unique abilities Blizzard has ever added at the time, where the Druid would essentially share an ability of their toolkit with the class. Depending on the class and depending on the spec they played, the abilities were different unless you were a mage, where all three specs got healing touch. Where the druid, depending on their spec, Resto, Guardian, Feral, or Balance, would get an ability of the class that they're sharing with. So for example, as a Feral druid, if you were to Symbiosis with a Shaman, you gain Feral Spirits. But if you were to Symbiosis with a Paladin of any spec, you gained Bubble. If Symbiosis were to return, it'd be one of the strongest abilities in the game, as certain classes could gain utilities, dispels, immunities, defensives, offensive abilities that would allow you to bypass certain mechanics. And already right now in Shadowlands, it's very difficult to plan out what kind of a tanks you want to run, DPS and healers in the raid, what kind of covenants everybody is, as well as what kind of utilities and immunities you're providing. Because Druid in a sense would be able to fill some of those gaps, but also I feel like the meta would be circled around Druids because some of the combinations that Druids would be able to bring would actually be out of this world. For Hunters, one of the most powerful abilities they've ever had is going to have to be Aspect of the Fox, which was a raid buff that Hunters provided to their groups. Hunters not really known for a lot of raid buffs. They have immunities, interrupts, traps, but generally nothing that they bring to the raid like a mage would with the buff. However, Aspect of the Fox was a buff that affected your whole party or raid, that allowed your party to keep casting abilities and spells for 6 seconds on the move. So you could take a whole raid with some coordination, and as they're popping their cooldowns at the beginning of the boss fight, you activate Aspect of the Fox so everybody can move in the position, dodging boss mechanics while still maintaining DPS or maintaining healing on the tanks as well as the group. If this ability were to return, the caster meta would definitely be even more solidified than it is now, as sometimes it feels like being melee class, it's a little bit awkward with so many casters that generally benefit better inside of raid situations. But imagine if they were to bring something like this for Survival Hunter as a meme spec that doesn't really get a lot of play or a lot of respect. I imagine a lot more players would find Survival Hunter their best friend inside of a raid. Majority of the mage toolkit in Shadowlands right now is actually pretty strong. And it was very difficult for me to find an ability that was super unique, that was super strong, but also very, very useful, except for Displacement. Mostly an arcane mage ability, it allowed you to reverse blink to a previous blink location, which gave you a refund on a blink ability. Together with Shimmer, which gives you 2 blinks in a row, you're able to blink twice with Shimmer, reverse blink with Displacement, and then blink again afterwards. This would give mages incredible mobility in Shadowlands, especially for some of the fights where mobility is key, as some of the casters play Night Fate just to be able to move around the battlefield and execute mechanics easier. An arcane mage for Castle Nathria in the fight where you have to move seeds would, I think, be able to solo a couple of seeds by themselves if they were Night Fate with Displacement. And more mobility for a class can be kind of cracked, and I think mages with Displacement would be incredibly strong just for the movement itself. When it comes to monks, they've actually lost quite a few abilities over expansions, but none of them were as unique and as strong as Zen Meditation. At one point, all 3 specs of monks had it, but right now only Brewmaster has it, but it's a much weaker version, where for Brewmaster, all it does is reduces the amount of damage you take by 60% as long as it's not a melee auto-attack physical hit. Back in the day, all 3 specs had a much stronger Zen Meditation that reduced damage taken by 90% while channeling it for 8 seconds, and while you channel it, it redirects up to 5 harmful spells from your allies towards the monk. Healer monks in particular, compared to other healers, definitely lack some sort of a defense to go out to use for the party or for the raid. They have a ton of healing, but if your party gets one shot and the whole health bar goes splat, there's no health bar to heal. So if they were to bring back Zen Meditation, I imagine the stocks for monks would be insanely high. Paladin toolkit is actually quite fast in Shadowlands, and I thought maybe I should talk about some of the different auras they've lost, but they're really mostly specific, going for like resistance auras from different elements, or going for very, very specific buffs or debuffs for their allies. Instead, I decided in this video to put the ability of Emancipate, because ignoring mechanics and nullifying them can actually be kind of broken in Shadowlands. Currently in Shadowlands, let's say you have a boss, and let's say that boss sends out slow-moving missiles from time to time, and those missiles come with a slow effect if they hit you, while also doing a bit of shadow damage. If you have a Hand of Freedom on you, and one of these missiles touches you, because this missile has a slow effect, it nullifies the slow. But the slow and the damage are tied together, so if you immune the slow, you actually immune the damaging component. Quite a lot of abilities in Shadowlands are in a very similar department, where you can actually cheese mechanics and certain damage and modifiers by putting a Hand of Freedom on an ally. Now, Blizzard uses slows as part of game mechanics for bosses and dungeons quite often, and imagine if as a paladin you could just remove them completely. While you're hit by a slow, a mechanic is about to build up, and as soon as the slow reaches its peak, then something happens, but as a paladin you essentially would be able to remove the slow, and in some cases completely nullify and remove mechanics. It would be kind of a mana expensive ability, and it only works in the paladin themselves, but there are ways to bait boss mechanics, and I imagine that there would be some players with genius IQ that would be able to find some really brutal ways to obliterate boss mechanics. While we're on the topic of ignoring mechanics with monks and paladins, let's add priest into the mix with Spectral Guise. It's an ability that gave priest a kind of like a vanish on a 30-second cooldown that allowed them to leave like an image of themselves while they blend into the shadows, able to stealth away from enemies while still staying in combat. Priest used this a lot in PvP in order to dodge certain powerful spells from hitting them, or even dodge certain crowd controls before the rogue would run up and kidney shot them. But in PvE, it also could be used to dodge mechanics, and right now in Shadowlands we do that regularly. Vanish, Invis, and Feign Death can be used for certain bosses and dungeons and raids in order to prevent and even ignore certain boss mechanics altogether. And being able to break bosses and some of the things they do is pretty broken in itself. Speaking of broken, rogues generally have had talents and traits and passives in the past that have allowed them to do some really cheesy things. And for rogues, I decided to go with the ability of Bribe. Bribe was unique, not because it broke the game, but it kind of did. It was one of the strongest and one of the most long-term duration mind control abilities on a humanoid. Certain classes have the ability to mind control enemies, like Death Knights with undead and Warlocks with demons, but in terms of controlling humanoids, that's pretty difficult, as the only class that can do it is a priest, for a very short time. As a Shadow Priest, you are losing time where you could be doing damage. As a healing priest, you're losing the time where you could be healing the tank. so generally priests don't use mind control that often. But for outlaw rogues back in Legion, you had a very long cooldown ability of Bribe, where you could convince a humanoid target to fight for you and your party for 5 whole minutes. If you were to use this on a humanoid target, that maybe gives your allies some sort of a buff, like a 50% haste increase like they had back in Legion, I would imagine certain boss fights in Shadowlands and certain trash packs would be a joke when you bring a couple of Venthyr Boomkins plus a 50% haze buff, and all you would need is a few seconds until you watch everybody melt. I felt for rogues there was quite a lot of abilities I could have covered, but this was probably the best one that would be pretty broken within PvE scenarios. Shaman as a class has quite a bit of utility in Shadowlands. Whether you're Restoration or Enhancement, you actually are treated pretty well when it comes to raiding scenarios. Restoration Shaman does really well inside the dungeons and is one of the staple healers for majority of raid combinations. Enhancement Shaman has recently become quite popular within raids with Wind Fury Totem, not because Enhancement does damage themselves, but they buff the damage of other melee in the group, which can definitely benefit the full output of your raid composition altogether. For Shamans, looking to some of their older abilities, Stormlash Totem was one of those totems that I thought I should put on this list. It's a totem that for 10 seconds allows your allies in a raid and party to be charged with electricity and burst electricity nature damage on enemies whenever they use their abilities. Classes that had a lot of abilities to use during the burst rather than slow casting classes with a few abilities gained the biggest benefit out of this. Rest of Shaman and Shamans in general are pretty good, but this would give them even extra utility to bring into raids, making them pretty much mandatory. And I imagine for certain Rest of Shamans, it would be a little bit easier to compete against the damage output that Holy Paladins bring, as Stormlash Totem together with Bloodlust back in those days was actually a pretty solid combination. Warlock is a class that actually has quite a bit of utility to bring into dungeons and raids, and are generally welcome in parties. But they're not mages, they're not really boomkins, they don't really have the craziest damage out there, and one thing they lack compared to some of the other classes is some sort of a damage immunity. Warlocks are generally tanky. The mobility issues for Warlocks is solved if you end up playing the Night Fate Covenant, but in terms of raw immunity to maybe use against certain boss mechanics, that is something that is a little bit missing. There's a lot of abilities I could have added onto this video, but I thought Dark Bargain was an interesting one that Warlocks would generally benefit from. For 3-minute cooldown, you prevent all damage for 8 seconds. However, after the shield fades, 50% of that damage prevented is dealt over 8 seconds, which is somewhat easy to heal if the healers are prepared. If you have some sort of extra health buff or a couple of absorbs, you actually could mitigate some of the strongest hits in the game with quite a bit of healing cooldowns and overlaps. Warlocks already bring quite a lot of things to the team, from Hellstones to being able to battle res, gateways and teleports, but also having an immunity on their side I think would benefit them quite greatly and make them quite busted in Shadowlands. Warriors, a class, have had some of the strongest traits, some of the strongest talents in the game, given and taken away over time, and some of the most fun playstyles like the Gladiator playstyle during WoD. However, out of all the abilities I could put it on this list, I think the most broken one to add right now would be Skull Banner. In terms of the same utility as adding someone to give to your group, Skull Banner is a 3-minute cooldown from back in the Mr. Pandaria days that increased the critical damage of your party and raid members within 40 yards by 20% for 10 seconds. 20% more crit damage for your whole raid would be actually insane, especially if you have a couple classes that benefit from crit greatly. Destro Warlocks buffing up the Chaos Bolts, Fire Mages for all their abilities, and those Venthyr Boomkins, if those abilities crits, they're gonna do even more damage. Warriors already bring quite a bit to the team with a mandatory raid buff, but with Skull Banner, they will be even stronger within dungeons in particular. Where Warriors can do quite a bit of damage, they don't always match up against some of the other classes, but I think this would make them from some of the more questionable DPS to bring to a must-have mandatory DPS in every single team composition. And that's gonna be my video on some of the strongest abilities from some of the recent expansions of World of Warcraft that would absolutely wreck the balance, or whatever is left of Shadowlands classes currently. I could have picked abilities like Wreck Bomb, like for Paladins from back in the day, but I feel like that one gets overused in way too many videos, and I already feel bad for going for the low-hanging fruit Symbiosis, but I felt like it deserved to be mentioned. thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Let me know if you want me to do a PvP version for some of the strongest passive talents and abilities from old that would be amazing in the current version of PvP. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see all of you in the next one.